So, um, so welcome to this last session of the seminar series, Phenomenological Transfers. Today we will have a closing workshop with 3 speakers. We will start with Professor Rosemary Rizzo-Patron. She's going to present a talk on Husserl and the system's view of life. So Professor Rizzo-Patron works at the Department of Humanities at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. She did her doctoral studies in philosophy at the Catholic University of Louvain. Since 1999, she's secretary of the Latin America Circle of Phenomenology, and from 2004, head of the Peruvian Circle of Phenomenology and Hermeneutics. She is a member of several phenomenological societies and advisory boards of international philosophy journals and book series. Her research is on Husserl and Kant transcendental philosophies, the continental phenomenological tradition, the intertwinement of epistemological, practical, axiological, and intercultural problems. She is the author and editor of several papers and book chapters of these subjects, including the books Husserl en Diálogo, Lecturas y Debates, published in Bogotá, El exilio del sujeto, mitos modernos y posmodernos, published also in Bogotá, La agonía de la razón, reflexiones desde la fenomenología práctica, published in Madrid. She's also editor of the books La racionalidad ampliada, Nuevos horizontes de la fenomenología y hermenéutica, published in Bogotá, La razón y sus fines, Elementos para una antropología filosófica en Kant, Husserl y Horkheimer, Hildesheim, and Acta Phenomenologica Latinoamericana, published in Lima and Mexico. She's also editor of the journal Estudios de Fenomenología. Rosemary, we want to thank you for sharing your time today, and I think we are very excited to hear you talking about the system's view of life and the relation with Husserlian phenomenology. So you can start.
Okay, thank you very much, Rafael. The first thing I want to do before presenting my paper, I want to congratulate the organizers of this, for the successful development and conclusion of this seminar series, Phenomenological Transfers, Representations, Images, and Social Imaginaries, which has been developing since March the 5th. And I want also to thank all the participants in the name of the Peruvian Circle and of Phenomenology and Hermeneutics. So I'm going to start right away. Okay. So my talk has to do with phenomenological transfers because it has to do with the relationship between what I see can be a fruitful relationship between Husserl's phenomenology and the system's view of life. I'll read the abstract. Husserl's phenomenological philosophy represents the last, in my view, significant Western attempt to provide a coherent and systematic philosophical foundation to all human achievements endowed with meaning and validity, spanning the entire spectrum of sciences and cultural disciplines. This effort is tantamount to a disavowal of the modern foundational project and a revolutionary attempt to redefine the Platonic sense of philosophy as episteme. His project restores a holistic sense of rationality beyond any ontological epistemological dichotomy, in which the concept of life in its highest incarnation, a sense endowing self-consciousness, occupies the center stage. The author claims, myself, that Husserl's phenomenological method and core metaphysical insights foreshadow a developing scientific paradigm, the scientific system, the system's view of life that is currently displacing the dualistic and mechanistic paradigm that has dominated Western sciences and philosophy since Descartes and Newton. Husserl's transcendental phenomenology as a scientific philosophy thus provides positive sciences and cultural endeavors with a unified vision and ultimate foundations, in a new sense of foundations. In so doing, it does not become naturalized. Instead, it phenomenologizes them. So I start with the first section. Transcendental phenomenology anticipates a system's view of life. Husserl's concept of philosophy as a rigorous science has been grossly misinterpreted, but in the past decades, a new and or other Husserl has emerged in the minds of interpreters and been appraised as the true one. It is now contended that he has always been the same, the scientifically oriented logocentric theoretician initially identified, and the newly discovered existential holistic life world ethical axiologically oriented philosopher. Those that insist in this last version and in the unity and consistency of Husserl's thought paradoxically have tended to misunderstand the very meaning of Husserl's revolutionary sense of a scientific philosophy. They may even dismiss it as an external horizon in his phenomenology. This has taken place with a book that has recently been published in Spain. They may even dismiss it then as an external horizon in his phenomenology, misinterpreted perhaps as a nod to current and natural sciences branded in the sense of a naturalizing of phenomenology. The modern and positivist sense of the term science is so inextricably rooted in Western minds that there is great difficulty in understanding Husserl's essentially radical distinction between any positive or objectively oriented science or discipline and his view of phenomenology as a rigorous science. The fact that phenomenology is also interested in focusing the primal sources of the sense and validity of natural sciences, as of any other sense and validity whatsoever, may have been erroneously understood as naturalizing phenomenology. In fact, it is wholly the reverse. Philosophy as a rigorous science, in Husserl's sense, is an entirely different concept than that of modern philosophers. Descartes' sense of a scientific philosophy emulates the purely theoretical, analytic, synthetic, mathematical paradigm and radically differs from Husserl's notion. The latter has a narrower kinship with Plato's sense of episteme and with the intertwinement among the different spheres of rationality. But Husserl's Platonic inspiration did not bear any sharp ontological dualism, a dualism that also has characterized mutatis mutandis Descartes and Kant's proposals many centuries later. Consequently, it is my belief that Husserl's phenomenological philosophy as the ideal of a unique, authentic science, in the highest sense of the word, I'm quoting Husserl, represents the last serious Western effort to provide a philosophical system and a unified account for every human achievement endowed with sense and validity. Husserl himself asserted, my phenomenology actually has within its field field of view all questions that can be put to man in the concrete, including as well all so-called metaphysical questions, insofar as they have possible sense in the first place. For it is their original formulation and critical delimitation which is precisely the vocation of this phenomenology. End of quote. To clarify my point, I will compare some salient points of Husserl's methodology and core metaphysical insights that have become clearer since the 2013 publication of Husserliana 42, with elements of this newly emerging scientific paradigm that Fritjof Capra and Pierluigi Luisi have christened as a systems view of life in their book bearing the same title in 2014. Allegedly, this new theoretical framework is currently operative in the most advanced social and scientific investigations as a unified vision that seems to be able to overcome the dualistic and mechanistic paradigm that has prevailed in Western sciences and philosophy since modern times. Thus, my purpose on this occasion is to roughly outline why I deem Husserl's philosophical phenomenology not only anticipates, but is also more compatible with this new unified vision than other current philosophical proposals, and thus able to provide it with a more consistent philosophical framework. Okay, I'm jumping to the second section, okay? From 20th century Lebensphilosophien to cognitive sciences and the naturalization of phenomenology. Of course, this is an abridged version of a much wider project that I have been working upon since approximately 6 years back, and it has been partly published in the book that Rafael has mentioned, La Racionalidad Ampliada, no? In one of the chapters of that book. Okay, so in this paragraph, from 20th century Lebensphilosophien to cognitive sciences and the naturalization of phenomenology. Both from a scientific and philosophical perspective, at least since the 19th century, the notion of life is of paramount significance for the genesis of the aforementioned paradigm shift. Yet the cultural divide or hiatus between the naturalistically oriented Lebensphilosophien on the one side and the humanistic oriented ones on the other gave rise to different traditions that scarcely engaged in mutual dialogue nor tolerated interdisciplinary research. However, both Dilthey and Bergson, but more explicitly Husserl, Bachelard, and later on Merleau-Ponty and Foucault, did highlight the natural roots of life's spiritual dimension. Husserl's philosophy was especially caught in the crossfire of both traditions, since both dismissed his work as fostering a skeptic subjectivism and or egocentric solipsistic relativism. The defenders of the human sciences rejected his alleged objectifying and logocentric scientism, whereas the advocates of the natural sciences rebuked his so-called anti-naturalism. The former highlighted his contribution to cultural, historical, and moral issues. The latter emphasized some of his intuitions in the formal sciences. Husserl, until the end, was adamant that, quote, positivism, in a manner of speaking, decapitates philosophy, having nothing to say to us regarding the most pressing metaphysical and ethical problems. Okay, by stressing that these could only be dealt with by referring them to the enigma of subjectivity, he gave rise to attacks from both traditions. Only few understood, and in his view, quote, to recognize that naturalism is a failed philosophy by reason of principle does not mean to abandon the idea of a rigorously scientific philosophy, a philosophy from the ground up. End of quote. Since the birth of cognitive sciences some 45 years ago, with the contributions of biologists such as Gregory Bateson on the one side and the Chileans Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, founders of the Santiago cognitive theory on the other, the Cartesian concept of mind as a res or substance was finally abandoned. It started to be dealt with as a process, characterized in terms of organized patterns and relations common to every living organism. Soon, cognitive sciences combined the work of biologists with that of psychologists and epistemologists, to which the contribution of quantum physicists, chemists, and of the nonlinear interpretation of neuronal networks were soon added. To be sure, initially, the human mind was modeled after cybernetics. Hubert Dreyfus's merit was to single out Fullesdal as having called out Husserl's early contribution to cognitive sciences and philosophy of mind with his version of intentionality. At the same time, Dreyfus seemed that Husserl anticipated and replicated artificial intelligence, but that the latter, in his view, was unable to reproduce the functions and capacities of human minds. He decided thus to introduce Husserl to analytic philosophers and cognitive scientists, assimilating his work, Husserl's work, to theirs. As a pragmatist phenomenologist, Dreyfus considered the work of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty as offering better elements to prove his argument against artificial intelligence. Since then, cognitive sciences slowly introduced first-person perspectives, experiences within the framework of the research whereby the enactivist approach to human experiences began to develop. As aforementioned, cognition ceased to be conceived as the mere possession of mental representations of a pre-given world, but was rather understood since then as the active interaction in action of the embodied mind with its natural and social environment, whereby the mind constitutes itself while simultaneously constitutes or brings forward a meaningful world. I reckon that Husserl began to be mentioned as a philosopher of interest when the biologist Varela proposed the term neurophenomenology in 1994, under the influence of the young French phenomenologist Nathalie Desprats, as a discipline called upon to solve David Chalmers' heart cognitive problem, which referred to the emergence of self-consciousness. Soon this research fell under the misleading call to naturalize phenomenology. However, as Sahavi reported, the four editors of Naturalizing Phenomenology conceived their project as laying bare the possible limitations and insufficiencies of the concept of naturalization. I quote Sahavi. Okay, most revealing of all, however, is perhaps a reply given by Varela to a question that I posed to him at a meeting in Paris in 2000. The volume, Naturalizing Phenomenology, was only intended as the first part of a larger project. The second complementary volume, which unfortunately was never realized due to Varela's untimely death, was planned to carry the title Phenomenologizing the Natural Sciences. Thus, they had begun to understand that there was no need to oppose a sound and newly understood naturalism to a transcendental perspective. Indeed, decisive advances in theoretical physics since the beginning of the 20th century drastically transformed the understanding of objectivity, subjectivity, and knowledge. A striking early exponent was Hermann Weyl, a mathematician, theoretical physicist, and Einstein's colleague whose work on the general theory of relativity and quantum mechanics was influenced by Husserl's transcendental idealism, concretely by Ideas 1. Recently, the neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and philosopher Thomas Fuchs is developing his work under Husserl's influence, emphasizing the role of embodiment in activism, temporality, and intersubjectivity, which are topics that have been talked about during this seminar series. Capra and Luisi, authors of The Systems View of Life, dedicated their book to Varela's groundworking work. However, they are only indirectly and barely, though respectfully, aware of Husserl's work. Their research, starting with their own expertise as theoretical physicists, dynamic systems theorists, and biochemists, has matured during 4 decades, enriched by multifarious scientific groundbreaking research in biochemistry, physics, mathematics, dynamic system theories, ecology, psychology, anthropology, cognitive sciences, medical sciences, and social and political sciences. But why should these widespread groundbreaking investigations be characterized as a paradigm shift? Why? In sciences and culture, and be labeled the systems view of life? In their view, it is because in all of those fronts of science and culture, a perspective shift from physics to the life sciences became increasingly manifest. No, in my view, this perceptive shift squares well with Husserl's idea of a radical, transcendental, and open-ended philosophical foundation, not only of natural sciences, but also of every human achievement endowed with meaning and validity. Perceptive shifts and scientific revolutions. Well, this, we're going to go very fast through this section, because the term paradigm shift, of course, stems from Thomas Kuhn's 1962 work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. We perfectly know that Kuhn himself was Popper's pupil and was influenced by Piaget and Coiré, who followed Husserl's courses in Göttingen, also Quine, among others. A scientific paradigm, in their view, or in Kuhn's view, is the ensemble of universally recognized scientific achievements that for a time provide model problems and solutions to a community of practitioners, no? So there's a difference between normal science and extraordinary science, or abnormal, which is a philosophical period in which scientists reflectively investigate their own presuppositions, concepts, theories, etc. So, okay, Kuhn and later Capra and Luisi, among many others, following Husserl's earlier yet unnoticed forebodings, have perceived that the Cartesian epistemological paradigm and Newton's mathematical deterministic and technicist paradigm exhibit signs of crises since the 19th century. The history of science shows that these crises first showed up in all of the natural and social life sciences first, no? Biology, chemistry, psychology, linguistics, history, art, economy, sociology. So the Newtonian paradigm didn't work in those sciences first. No, these as natural, but it also started to show the crisis, started to emerge in chemistry and thermodynamics as well. These as natural scientists or sciences were not supposed to contradict the mechanistic, physicalistic, objectivistic, and linear Newtonian paradigm. But the increasing anomalies and crises that followed these natural hard sciences finally caught up with physics, giving rise to a perceptual shift from physics to life sciences. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these crises in all of these different sciences, which I mentioned here. No, perhaps regarding the new scientific revolution, especially in physics, with the so-called new physics in a complete quantum theory, plus Einstein's discovery, and regarding special and general relativity, regarding this scientific revolution, especially in physics, no, the words of the 1977 Nobel laureate Ilya Prigozhin were particularly harsh. He claimed that after 1960, the universal application of Newton's mechanics and its laws of movement proved to be incorrect. I am quoting Prigozhin, 1994. For example, his research and contributions, Prigozhin's, regarding the second law of thermodynamics, or entropy, revealed that the irreversibility of time is not a subjective illusion, as Einstein still believed, and that it is operative, entropy, operative everywhere in the universe, not only producing disorder, but unpredictable new orders. He had previously stated that if, quote, for every billion thermal photons in disorder, there is one elementary particle supposed to be able to transmit ordered structures, end of quote. Then not only in the biological, but also in the physical universe, novelties, as Prigozhin states, I quote again, new spatial temporal organizations emerge. The universe has a history. This is another quote from Prigozhin, and time has a creative role. In this context, equations become nonlinear, for they admit more than one solution. No, this is Prigogine in 1989. Other scientists, also as MIT professor Evelyn Fox Keller, who was not a phenomenologist, suggested since 1994, she was interested in psychoanalysis, and she was interested also in feminist movements, no? Evelyn Fox Keller. But since 1994, she has suggested the need to overturn science's objectivistic approach and she said that Newton's physicalist paradigm and its upshot, the objectified image of subjectivity that ensues from this paradigm, Newton's paradigm, is precisely constituted by subjects, whereby the role of subjectivity must be recast. No? Okay. So the systems view of life. Let's go faster. The slow emergence of a systemic paradigm that has taken up a large part of the 20th century, coexisting almost until its last decades with elements of the previous mechanistic paradigm, no? So it has been slowly progressing since the beginning of the 20th century, no? And it has not fully penetrated every dimension of sciences and culture, but it has advanced a good deal. So according to Capra and Luisi, it began toward the end of the 19th century in different domains, in the Gestalt psychology, biology, the nascent ecology, in quantum physics, etc. Though unknown to Capra and Luisi, in my view, Husserl's contribution to genetic phenomenology and generative problems square well with this silent revolution from automata to organisms since the beginning of the 20th century. Parts began to be examined from wholes in biology rather than wholes being explained in linear causal sequences from their various parts, as was the case for most of the 20th century, for example, which was called the century of the genes, and is still the case today. Schrödinger still believed in 1944 that life's stability was due to the fact that it worked as a well-built clock. Thus, the life sciences gradually began to approach living systems from the wholes to the parts. Following a downward causation, ecosystems were investigated as containing social systems, which were treated as including organisms, which are composed of organs. From organs, scientists continued to look lower to tissues, to cells, to biotic and prebiotic chemicals. This method eventually led to the molecular soup and then to the atomic and subatomic realms. So it's the downward causation. So this is the process of understanding nature, not from elements up, which is the Descartes analytic synthetic method, no? Studies reveal two opposite tendencies at each living systemic level, an integrative one towards more complex systems and a self-assertive and self-organizing one in charge of preserving the individual autonomy of subsystems. Each higher level of organized complexity began to be described with the notions of emergent properties, but from upward downwards, and interconnectedness of the parts from the whole. In ecology, living systems started to be understood as interacting with their Umwelt, environment, as networks of networks within the web of life. Since the development of quantum theory by an international team led by Niels Bohr in the 1920s, the new physics took its first definite steps. However, as its research began to contribute to the knowledge of living organisms and their molecular elements, this new physics first integrated and cemented the system's view of life. Some of the novel notions of the emergent physical paradigm are the following. First, the uncertainty principle, quantitatively expressed the limits of our intuitive capacities and human imagination to comprehend the subatomic universe. Second, the intrinsic properties of elementary particles depend on the experimental context and on the observer's mind. The world thus appears as a complicated tissue of events in which connections of different kinds of alternate or overlap or combine of different kinds alternate or overlap or combine, and thereby determine the texture of the whole. Thereby the whole determines the part, as Heisenberg states. Third, a new notion of causality emerges. No linear determinism is detected at the quantum level. Fourth, the observer's, the subject's role is not limited to measuring phenomena. It also intervenes in their production. What we observe is not nature itself, but rather nature exposed to our method of questioning. I'm quoting from Heisenberg. Fifth, matter exhibits a dynamic and restless character, for mass is only a form or bundle of energy that changes into other forms of energy, etc. Summing up, the laws of nature pertaining to this new physics involve a perceptual shift from parts to wholes, from atomism to interconnectivity, from objects to relations, from measures to mappings, from quantities to qualities, from structures to processes, from causal determinism to patterns of probability, and from causality to statistics. All of these characteristics reverberate in Husserl's transcendental turn, both in his warning regarding the forgotten foundation of objective sciences in the life world, and in the evidence of intuition, despite its finitude, as phenomenology's principle of principles upon which the infinite mathematical and symbolic worlds are built. Nonlinearity and complexity, core notions of the systems view of life, are recent developments of the classical systems theories and cybernetics. Developed between 1940 and 1970, cybernetics, no? Husserl, who died in 1938, could not have predicted them, no? The development of classical systems theories and cybernetics. Besides its holistic view, another essential concept of this new paradigm is a feedback loop pattern developed by Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann, and Alan Turing, among others, which consists of, I quote, the feedback loop pattern causality, a circular arrangement of causally connected elements in which an initial cause propagates around the links of the loop so that each element has an effect on the next until the last feeds back the effect into the first element of the cycle. The consequence of this arrangement is that the first link input is affected by the last output, resulting in self-regulation of the entire system, as the initial effect is modified each time it travels around the cycle. Okay, so this is groundbreaking work, no, in science, in the developing of the systems view of life. Non-linearity also stems from biology alongside the notion of self-organization, as I've already said. Scientists finally acknowledged since 1970 that nature is relentlessly non-linear, and that small causes may produce dramatic effects, giving rise to initial instabilities at the origin of new forms of self-organization. So I quote from Capra and Luisi, nature at large turns out to be more like human nature, unpredictable, sensitive to the surrounding world, and influenced by small fluctuations. End of quote. Each living organism from the first cell to human beings is a bounded system with an inside world, a self, so to say, that maintains its individuality vis-a-vis its surrounding outside world through a semi-permeable membrane whereby it absorbs nutrients and energy and expels its wastes in a process called cognition. Thus, each organism is an operationally closed, yet thermodynamically open system, sustaining and regenerating itself while interacting in an input-output structural coupling with the environment. Hence, life is a non-localized, emergent, global property that cannot be reduced to or found in any of its parts. The biologists Maturana and Varela named the internal self-maintaining and self-organizing process that coincides with individual lifespan, autopoiesis, and the second process as of interaction with the external surroundings, cognition. A process that not only affects the organism's inner autopoietic processes, but also transforms, as I already stated, the organism's outer surroundings. Capra and Luisi believe that this pattern not only applies from cells to the more complex forms of natural life, but it is legitimate to extend it to the higher forms of communal life, social, economic, historic, etc., ecologic, albeit in a certain symbolic way. With death, the natural autopoietic organisms disintegrate, whereby their molecular components are yielded back to the environment and used for other purposes. If life is an emergent property from the prebiotic world, then the mind is an emergent property of life. There is a long non-linear evolution from the prebiotic molecules to the emergence of human cognition and self-consciousness. Both the upward causation implied by the emergence of complex properties does not tell, but this upward causation does not tell the whole story. Capra and Luisi show that the developed organism determines its organs and other components in a downward causation. And when it does, it is a complex upward-downward process whereby mutations occur due to deterministic factors intertwined with random, contingent, and unpredictable ones, describable only exposed with a dynamic nonlinear tools. Ilya Prigogine held in 1989 that today, as physics attempts to incorporate instability, the world we see outside us and the world we see within us are converging. This convergence of two worlds is perhaps one of the most important cultural events of our age. I end the quote. So Husserlian phenomenology is a look from within, which is converging with the look from without. Okay. Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, which develops as a look from within and sensu lato, as in a downward causation, seems to me to be the last Western philosophical system that is compatible with the system's view of life's new paradigm. Not only because it unfolds from the primary nature of consciousness and spirit as the highest level of life's evolution, but also because it is the first and only instance from which the entire history of the universe, from the Big Bang or further back, acquires its intelligibility. I have already alluded to Husserl's estrangement from the continental analytic traditions. One of the pervasive misunderstandings concerns transcendental phenomenology's claim that as first philosophy, in the sense of an ultimately founding science, it provides an ultimate foundation to the entire universe of what is humanly cognizable or experienced. No? Since Aristotle and later Descartes, the notion of foundation has been solely associated with deductive, demonstrable inferences or arguments in a broader sense. Husserl's claim is indeed impossible with that sense of Begründung. But it is not, or Fundirung, but it is not what Husserl means here. A scientific and radical philosophy of ultimate foundations refers to something deeper and primal than mere positive sciences that exhibit inferential or calculative proofs. Indeed, a philosophy that, in the words of Kant, might come forth as a science, in words of Husserl, is a philosophy based on ultimate self-responsibility, whereby its ultimately legitimizing source, no, these are Husserl's words, source of cognition, is everything originarily, so to speak, in its personal actuality, offered to us in intuition, but also within its limits. End of quote. In other words, it is a philosophy that acknowledges that it can only again draw its truth itself from originary data, called upon to serve as a foundation, a principium in the genuine sense of the word. Okay, furthermore, these originary data do not constitute a complete or closed system of truths, but unfold as an infinite historical process, no? Realizable by generations of philosophers in an intersubjective spiritual community, as humble workers, etc., etc. That is why, until his old age, Husserl considered himself a genuine beginner, no, in the development of this task. So when Husserl designates transcendental subjectivity as a locus of philosophy's ultimate foundations, he means by it transcendental experiences, namely constitutive meaning-giving and validating functions. Thus, the foundational domain is not a real object within the world, but complex processes that we put forth as responsible subjects for the world. Subjects that are in intentional correlation with the world in Maturana and Varela's wide sense of cognition. The descriptions of psychological and transcendental subjects differ, yet paradoxically, they belong to the same underlying subject. This is also Kant's view in his Critique of Pure Reason, B 155. Well, and Husserl also in the Crisis, in section 53. So, seen from different perspectives, indeed, subjects not only experience the world, but also grasp themselves as worldly entities, as human beings, as rational animals, as persons, among other inner worldly entities. So the general thesis of the natural attitude that the world is always there, immer Dasein der Welt, no? And that we are entities within it, is the underlying conviction of every other theoretical, practical, or valuing position taking. The epoche strips subjectivity of its entitative character and unveils its underlying universal a priori of correlation, namely intentionality, process. Transcendental reduction, the method of retrospective interrogation, allows the ascent from mundane subjectivity to transcendental subjectivity, namely to purely lived first-person experiences, thus processes. This method leads to intuitive descriptions of the eidetic structures, functions, and modes of transcendental experiences. Thus, both aspects of the method, the transcendental reduction and eidetic descriptions, are deemed to ensure the universality of this new philosophical enterprise conceived as first philosophy, as the indispensable preconditions for any other philosophy or metaphysics, whatever. Okay, so Husserl's transcendental eidetic phenomenology as first philosophy is understood as an Arbeitsphilosophie, no, an ongoing process, and it's an elementary grammar upon which his idea of philosophy is going to be built, no? In his view, one of the main upshots of its intentional or constitutive analysis is a universal theory of sciences inspired by the Leibnizian idea of a genuine universal ontology, no? Okay, as a systematic unity of all conceivable a priori sciences. But this is an upshot. This is a consequence, no? So, in this sense, Husserl's foundational procedure tallies up with a systemic downward causation mentioned by the system's view of life and highlighted as a primary nature of consciousness, no? As aforementioned, Husserl's transcendental phenomenology not only sets out from the highest and ultimate stage of life's evolution, mind, no? But from the sole and ultimate instance whereby the history of the universe and everything that surrounds us becomes intelligible. Okay. So I'm not going to read everything. I can later send you the whole text, the English text, okay? I think if I'll go to the pros and cons, a provisional balance, okay? So there's a lot to be said about Husserl, but I think I'll stop here because, I mean, we can see that in another context. So besides the traits we have already pointed out, autopoiesis, cognition, downward causation, Heisenberg's assertion whereby what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning, feedback, loophole, causality, there are other aspects of Husserl's philosophy that seem to me prima facie consistent with those put forward by the system's view of life. We summarize only a few. First, Husserl's aspiration to provide a universal and unifying account of all human productions endowed with sense and validity, both everyday achievements as well as scientific and cultural disciplines, beyond the hiatus or cultural divide in Western civilization since Descartes. Second, the notion of transcendental subjectivity or transcendental experiences, mind as understood as processes, as complex processes, not as a res substance, an object. Third, Husserl's notion of natural factual sciences as providing empirical laws, but not pure or exact laws, thus as merely theoretically grounded probabilities. And this is something that Husserl is stating since the first volume of the Logical Investigations in 1900. This is something Husserl stated regarding Newton, no? Okay. Okay, so Husserl rejects, he didn't describe it in those terms, but he rejects the Newtonian linear causal determinism and objectivism, no? In physics. As a corollary, the conviction that every epistemic demand does not exclude, and I quote Husserl, the conceivability that what is evident could subsequently become doubtful, no? Which can always be recognized in advance by critical reflection on what the evidence in question does. Okay, so this would be the third trait, or the third converging trait of Husserl's transcendental phenomenology and the system's view of life. And fourth, the description of transcendental, embodied, intentional, and temporal subjectivity as a living monad that not only transforms itself, organizes and constitutes itself, as he states in the fourth Cartesian meditation, and which amounts to, is tantamount to autopoiesis, but also that constantly alters its environment in cognition, no, by constituting sense and meaningful worlds in a physical sense, in a cultural sense, in a scientific sense, etc., etc. Humans do not merely change themselves psychophysically, nor are limited to the natural environment as other species, but also configure their surrounding world in a meaningful spiritual way, culturally and universally. But some of the incompatibilities detectable between Husserl's systemic views and those of Capra and Luisi, as well as of Prigogine, have to be mentioned. Among others, they are the following. The latter, Capra and Luisi, no, adamantly reject teleology in their conception of nature, for they understand teleology as a necessarily metaphysical, regulative, and speculative principle in Leibniz's, Kant's, or Hegel's senses. Whereas Husserl instead discovers in the structure of intentionality and in the inner processes leading from passive to active subjective life, an inner open-ended teleology, the outcome of which is not entirely predictable. What is constituted from intentionality, the outcome that constituted is not entirely predictable. The authors of the system's view of life do not acknowledge the essential distinctions between, on one side, the psychophysical, noetic, and or symbolic, linguistic vehicles, and on the other side, the noematic, perceptual, conceptual, valuative, normative, sense-meaning contents transmitted by them. Only the latter, only the sense-meaning contents, are bearers of objectivity and validation. I suspect that this metabasis eis allogenos also affects most of the studies in cognitive sciences. So this entraps them in a sort of psychologism in spite of them, okay? This is a naturalization, psychologization, finally, of these sense-meaning contents, which are not the same as the vehicles that transmit them. No, we can talk about that later. So, and third, although Capra and Luisi propose a look from within, that they acknowledge not only in phenomenology, but also in psychological introspection and in Oriental spiritual traditions, such as Buddhism, no, which was the case also of Varela and many others. They still seem to favor a unilateral, objectivistic, third-person criterion regarding the hard problem of consciousness. In sum, in sum, despite the fact that we still have to deepen and solve some or several incongruencies, I do believe that Husserl's transcendental phenomenology is not only more compatible, but also more consistent with this unified vision that at its deepest level involves a perceptual shift from physics to the life sciences. No, this is Capra and Luisi's expression. This path could go beyond the one Varela expressed as a future task, not only the phenomenologization of the natural sciences, but of culture in general. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. I guess we will have so many questions. So we are a bit out of time. So I would like to ask the participants, first raise your hand and try to be very specific with your questions. And also, Rosemary, try also to be very specific on your answers so we exploit the time as best as we can. And having said this, I think it would be better if we skip the short pause and go straight with the questions until the next presentation. So I think Francisco Parra raised his hand first. Francisco, would you please formulate your question? We can't hear you, Francisco. You're mute.
No, I can't. But I think Mauricio Christian was raised his hands first, but if it's okay with him.
Then we'll go with Christian, of course.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professora Rosemary, for this amazing presentation. And I had a question about the technique and the application of the sciences, and even the part of production of dispositives, right? Do you think phenomenology can reach this point of application somehow? Is it also transformed the idea of theory and application itself, or even the way it's produced now? And then I had other questions, but I think I'm going to keep that one only. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I think the most important part of your question regards what Husserl understands as technique, and application. His first use of that term concerned formal sciences, okay? So it's the conscious mind, the rational mind in its highest developments that develops techniques, among which logical, mathematical techniques. But further on, you can go to these techniques that have been conceived and that have been materialized in physical instruments that enhance and that prolong human capacities, okay? So techniques are produced, are constituted by human consciousness and rationality. So I think the question has to go that phenomenology, Husserlian phenomenology, helps us understand what these techniques mean and how they are related to our human constitutive abilities, okay? Of course, originally our abilities are limited. Intuition is limited, okay? And that's why Husserl, for example, regarding symbolic sciences, algebraic, formal, etc., mathematical, etc., Husserl conceives these as overcoming the limitations, the finitude of human capacities. But humans, with their consciousness and their rationality, are capable of building, producing the techniques that help them overcome their original finitude, no? And so it helps them to reach further. So it's what's interesting in your question, I believe, what's more important is the insight that phenomenology introduces to what technical applications mean. Phenomenology is not going to replace them. It's going to introduce a insight of what they mean and how they are produced, and the illimited capacity that we have to produce further and further technological tools.
Vamos a la pregunta de Christian.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Rafael. Well, thank you very much, Professor Rosemary. It was very inspiring, your presentation. I just was wondering whether how do you see that, for example, Husserl in Husserliana 6:29 has some bilateral relation to this problem of biology, a phenomenological, conducted biology. You know, it's like that the way of entering into nature with the method of genetic phenomenology, precisely speaking about Paarung and Abbau, you know. So for me, my question is like, how do you see this problem? Because some people, so for example, Scrabble or Dieter Loma, think that it's not a good idea to think about a rational or irrational subject that can precisely be understood through the genetic approach. So they start with a completely mature human rational being. So I think that maybe your presentation is precisely related that we can also explain through phenomenology the ambit of life, and then we also must include life in their different forms. You know? So I would like to know, what do you think about this? Do you see that we can also go through this project of life, of phenomenological conducting way of seeing life through precisely this genetic approach and the consideration that Husserl makes about biology? Thank you very much.
Okay, the consideration that Husserl makes about biology, where I think you quoted something of 1929. Do you mean the Cartesian Meditations? I didn't get that. Christian.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was vlog. I don't know why. No, they are precisely speaking about this part of crisis. You know, the Husserliana 6, but the supplements. You know, and 29, because Husserl speaks precisely there that there is a difference between the ambit of physics, because they are like far away from the ambit of intuition. You know, but Husserl says there precisely that biology could be near or close to phenomenology because it's precise in the field of intuition, of seeing to living beings, you know. So that's related to my question.
Well, what I would point out, is that Husserl addresses this problem since 1912, 1913, when he was developing ideas, okay? But he's also addressing this problem since way back, since, for example, 1907, when he was working about the constitution of space from the living body, okay? The original constitution of space is from the living body. So, I mean, the idea that consciousness is incarnate and that belongs in nature is already there. It's already there. It's already in the logical investigations. I mean, when he's talking about perception, of course he is implying that there's a human body that perceives, no, with the senses, no, and then the kinesthetic movements, etc., etc. And the thing is that the structure of ideas 2 starts with how normally, if we want to talk about consciousness has its own properties that are not physical, and yet they are always given in a physical context, in an organic context, okay? So that's the first part of ideas 2, which englobes the constitution of the material and of the organic body. I mean, if you go to the structure and the functions of consciousness, he says there, it has its own properties that are not the causality or the things that happen between physical elements, but they're not given apart from them. No, so he doesn't talk about supervening properties in the sense that now they talk about those properties, but it's there. And also the personal, the spiritual dimension of our psychophysical and spiritual personal unity. It supervenes the psychophysical. It doesn't come alone. It has its own properties. No, so in the upward, downward, loophole causation, that's what I wanted to mention, answers your problem. It's perfect in Husserl. It's there.
Vamos a la pregunta de Santiago. Let's go to Santiago, please. Santiago?
Yeah. So, Professor Rosemary, thank you very much for your presentation. I really liked it. And I would like to ask a bit more about this. It is in continuity with Christian's question, and he answered to him. So it was clear to me after you made this reference to ideas 2 that the structures of consciousness for Husserl are not given ex nihilo. They are not given in the void, but they're always in physical contexts. But is it enough just with this thesis? It is enough to claim that Husserl would admit that there is an upward relation between the physical and the structures of consciousness? Because for me, I don't know if it's that clear. And I see that this relation of upward, downward, it's much clearer in Merleau-Ponty, for example, when he speaks of the sublimation of the structures of the body into structures of consciousness, and the downward relation between both of them. So I would like to ask you about this point. If you don't think that there is still some tension between the system's view of life and how Husserl would understand this downward relation.
Thank you. Thank you, Santiago. Listen, of course, if you just mention ideas 2 and the static presentation of that period, of course, there's a tension, and of course, you go to Merleau-Ponty and you see a better account, okay? But Merleau-Ponty, one of the things that I appreciate in Merleau-Ponty is that in a very, very short period of time, Merleau-Ponty read an immense number of manuscripts of Husserl, that put him in contact with already his genetic phenomenology. Okay, so it's in the genetic manuscripts that you see this teleology that emerges. For example, in the Berna manuscripts on time, for example, in all of the studies of association, in the logic lectures of 1920, 21, 23, 24, that ended up published as passive synthesis and active synthesis. Everything about association. In the C manuscripts, in the manuscripts on the life world that are published in Husserliana 39. Well, of course, Husserliana 29 is a complementary work of the crisis. But there are many, many, many manuscripts that are coming to the fore, are being recently studied and approached. And there you see how many of the basic Husserlian intuitions are taken up and very immediately put forward by Merleau-Ponty and developed in and also in a very fruitful and original way, no? But I don't see any real tension there. I see a perfect complement, no? If you take into account all of these genetic manuscripts, no?
So, Rosemary, I'll make a short question. So then we might conclude. Sorry for that, but I really want to ask you. From Wiener and Ashby, there is some theoretization on this notion of systems as well. So cybernetics is also to be a theory of systems and especially of the organization of them. And so when looking into some of the philosophical works from Wiener and also from Ashby, so they have different takes on what kind of knowledge you gain when approaching a phenomenon in terms of a system, or using like the analogy of the system. So for Wiener was like, so this Wiener says that you get a kind of approximate knowledge of reality. And with Ashby, the take is different. It's not approximate knowledge, but systems theory for him, it's about gaining control and prediction of complexity. So that is like, let's say, the epistemic gain of modeling a phenomenon in terms of a system. So from a philosophy of science perspective, you can say that a system, it's analogous to a mechanism in the sense that it's a tool you use to explore, let's say, a target system. So my question to you is, what is a system from a phenomenological viewpoint?
So I would go to as a closed system and an open system. So the thing is, there is predictability, of course, in a system. But what sort of predictability? So that's the point. No, in a Newtonian system, in a modern system, predictability has to do with a concept of time, a reversible concept of time. What has functioned in the past can function exactly in the future, and it's mathematical in a linear sense. So it's reversibility of time and mathematical in a linear sense. So predictability is exact predictability, total control. So in a phenomenological sense, but also in the systems view of life sense, okay, there is predictability because nonlinear systems and nonlinear equations allow for predictability, for probabilities, of which Husserl mentioned a lot, by the way, in Ideas 1. He says this is extremely important. This is going to be extremely important. He is always referring to probabilistic tools, okay? So there is a predictability, but not an exact one. So there's the possibility of an open novelty, something that may surprise you, in the sense that Prigogine said that one element in billions, in a molecular system, billions, one molecule can produce something unexpected in that sense.
Thank you, Rosemary. So we will now thank you so much for presenting today. And now we have to move to the presentation from Fabio Pellicer. Sorry, Fabio, for the delay. So now we are, Fabio is going to present on the role of things in human becoming and human remaining, cognitive archaeology and phenomenology in dialogue. So Fabio, Tommy Pellicer, obtained a PhD in philosophy from Ca' Foscari University in Venice in 2009 with a thesis on temporality and synthesis in phenomenology. He's a junior fellow at the Erich Auerbach Institute for Advanced Studies in Cologne, investigating the use of shadows as imaginary entities. During his doctoral studies, he was a visiting researcher at the Husserl Archives of Leuven and at the Mary Immaculate College in Ireland. He was also Wehrmacht Fellow at the University of Vienna, doing research on the handiness of signs. So thank you, Fabio, for joining this last session. And well, you can start now.
Yeah, let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for to you all, the organizer. I'm very happy I can present my work here. So basically, what I'm trying to do is to combine ideas from our cognitive archaeology and phenomenology in order to address the role that artifacts play in our experience, and in particular, how the fact that we use different things and that we have different ways of making things, for example, different materials, shaped different imaginaries, to put it very, very simply. And here I would like to explore the possible dialogue between phenomenology and cognitive archaeology and the so-called material engagement theory, which is a very, very important and interesting approach elaborated in particular by Lambros Malafouris, which combines different insights from different disciplines in order to understand the way in which making things, human beings, change what they are, so to speak, change the way they think about things, the way they relate each other, and so on. And I think I will be, compared to other contributions and other presentations in this series of conferences, I will kind of be talking about life in a way that is more connected to science and artifacts. So perhaps I am aware that I'm kind of getting exposed to the criticism that I'm making a rigid separation between what we call human being and other animals, other forms of life. And this is I want to stress that this is a problem that I've been thinking about, and I still think that it's worth keeping this distinction. So, as you can see, the general idea of material engagement theory is precisely the importance of things, of the things that we use for our experience. And for Malafouris, he says in an article that the definition of human being as homo faber is still the best way to capture the essence of what we are. And I would like to discuss how this is in part true, but I'm interested in how there is this capacity specific of the homo faber, which is mark making, science making, which is what I think makes us an animal symbolicum, so to speak. So I have two aims in particular. One is starting exploring how phenomenological accounts of tool behavior and expression might resonate or interact with concepts like an active sign and constitutive symbol. And these are the two concepts of material engagement theory where I would like to locate a kind of transfer or dialogue between phenomenology and cognitive archaeology. And I would like to highlight the expressive logic of material engagement. So I would like to show how what Malafouris calls material engagement, the material engagement with things, can be interpreted as an expressive phenomenon in Merleau-Ponty sense. And as you can guess, I'm kind of using ideas from Heidegger's concept of handiness and tools and Merleau-Ponty's concept of expressive acts. I won't have time to go into detail about how I intend to use Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, because I would like to use this time to give a general idea of how I think we can open the space for a dialogue between these two disciplines, terminology and cognitive archaeology. And maybe if we have time in the discussion, we can talk about more specific aspects of Merleau-Ponty's concept of expression or Heidegger's concept of handiness and ready to hand and so on. I will first introduce a few important aspects of material engagement theory, which I think they are the most relevant in a phenomenological perspective, at least as I understand it. Then I will make some examples of constitutive symbols and active signs. And in the center part, and the more important one, I will try to present what I think is the major challenge of understanding how things shape our mind. And I will focus on the fact that, to put it very roughly, tools are more than tools. So there is a surplus of meaning in our engagement with tools. And I would like to suggest that this is because the things that we encounter, the tools, they are not just encountered in what they are for us, but they are also encountered as things that show what they are for us. And there is this passage between encountering something in what it is for us and learning, so to say, to recognize this something as something that shows this being for, show that's something that shows what something is for us. I would like to locate here the real problem, the reason why our material engagement with things is something so cognitively complex and productive of meanings. And in particular, I will reflect on the relation between relevance and salience, between the importance that things are for us in a very basic sense, through affordances, like in tool behavior, and what they call salience, which has to do with, for example, the expressive patterns that we are able to introduce in the experience of the thing. And I would like, and I will conclude with a concrete example of the making of baskets in a certain culture has an expressive technique. And I would like to show here how the making of tools in this example is more than tool making. It's a kind of activity that enacts meanings and imaginary systems, so to say. So the first aspect of engagement theory that I want to stress has to do basically with the idea that we cannot really understand what we are as a species unless we really understand that we are a kind of species for which becoming is essential. So Malafuri says that human becoming, he distinguishes human becoming and becoming human as two different views of humanity. And human becoming means the process of ongoing transformation that characterizes human condition as indeterminate and incomplete and always about to become. And here, what is human, what defines the human being as an object worth to be studied in its past, present, and also future is precisely the becoming. And then in the other view, he says that becoming humans instead views human evolution more statically as the fixed result of an evolutionary process which equipped us with a set of anatomical, behavioral, and cognitive skills. And here we have more like something like the becoming of humans as a species, and what is human is not the becoming itself, but is a set of anatomical, behavioral, and cognitive skills. And the process in this view is more like, I would say, is appreciated and interpreted only as long as and in terms of how it leads to a stable configuration. While in human becoming, what humans are is the point of departure of processes of transformation. And this is why Malafuri distinguishes two different ontologies behind human becoming and becoming human, what he calls process ontology and what he calls substance ontology. And according to a process ontology oriented understanding of human evolution, a human is an entity for which becoming is essential. And this, as I understand it, means that what is essential is how, in a given point of our history or prehistory, anatomical, behavioral, and cognitive feature that was already there, maybe for since, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of years, these features are engaged and renegotiated in a way that leads to new configurations and transformations. And I want to make a very clear and perhaps paradigmatic example. And this has to do with the idea that we cannot really understand who we are, who we have become, and who we might be in the future as a symbolic species if we don't look into how we did start making science concretely. So how, in a certain moment of our evolution, of our prehistory, history, anatomical, cognitive, and behavioral features involved, for example, in tool making, were employed in a different and somehow strange way in order to create something new, like marks, lines, and images. So you have, an incredibly long history of prehistory where humans had this stable anatomical and cognitive configuration without having what we call science. So I would like to describe a few aspects of material engagement theory. One basically is the idea that what we call symbolic mind emerges in material engagement with things. So everything we think is characteristic of symbolic behavior, from complex cognitive skills like counting or time reckoning, for example, the discovery of clocks in the nature, for example, in the sun, the construction of machines to keep track of time, or religion, art, or these complex forms of behavior which shapes our relation with others and so on, is something that we must understand has an emerging property of our relation with the material world. And a connected idea is that, which is more implicit maybe, but I think it's important to stress, is that we should not explain artifacts like images as a consequence of an already given complexity of our mind, but rather we should learn to see artifacts as what made possible in the first place behavioral, cognitive, and social complexity. And I would like to add that this is also about how artifacts not only made possible social complexity, but also social cognitive and behavioral variability, the fact that what we call cultures are different from times to times and place to place. And I think this is very important because there is a kind of tendency in thinking, artifacts, we find images, we find decorations, strange kind of objects that were buried, we sometimes we tend to think like, we ask ourselves how complex was already our mind in order to produce this kind of strange and complex things, while we should do exactly the opposite. We should see how we learn to use things in a complex way, and how this triggered a complexity of behavior and cognitive and social complexity and so on. And another interesting aspect about material engagement theory, and I'm referring in particular to the presentation offered by Lambros Malafouris, especially in his book, Things That Shape the Mind, is the idea that artifact things must be interpreted as an active structures. And what interests me is how interpreting things as an active structures means interpreting things as an active science. And what I want to stress here is the sign, the fact that we interpret, we make sense of things as science. And the important point is that the reason why we can use the concept of sign as a way to interpret in an active way the inactivity of things is not because things stand for something, it's not because things are instantiations of meanings or representations, it's just because in the use of things, in our engagement with things, meanings emerge. That's what makes possible and in a way necessary to think things as signs. Because in the relation with things is where meanings and meaningfulness, to use an Heideggerian word, emerge. So for Malafouris, material science are not simply message carriers in some preordered social universe, but they are the actual physical forces that shape the social and cognitive universe. And he says very, very clearly that science must be interpreted in terms of how they signify rather than what. And he says that this is like interpreting science according to an expressive rather than representational logic. What I would like to do or start doing here is to explore this idea of an expressive logic in our relation with things. And I think that this idea resonates very, very well with some aspects of Merleau-Ponty's concept of expression, although Malafouris doesn't make any link between his approach and Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, but that's something that I would like exactly to explore here. And as I suggest to reformulate the problem, the how of science precedes and shapes what science conveys. Because what a sign conveys, what a sign expresses, depends on how a particular thing becomes silent, which is, I think, we can say this by, we can understand this by saying that the problem is how a thing becomes something whose presence does not exhaust itself in what this something does in a very strict sense. So this is when I think something really becomes engaging with us in a way that enacts meanings in a particular sense. When the presence of this something is something that does not rest in itself or needs being useful for this or that, but it's more like a presence that constitutes a kind of demand of sense that we address precisely, finding new meanings. But I will make some example of this. Now I would like briefly to consider a concrete example of constitutive symbol, which is the symbol of weight, the origins of the unity of weights, according to Connie Renfrew. And he says that weight could be experienced and apprehended in the first place only by the physical action of holding a heavy object in the hand and perceiving that it was heavier than other similar object. And he says that in a sense, stone cubes that we found from the past, serving has weight, has unity of weight, are symbolic of themselves. Weight has a symbol of weight. And I think it's very interesting precisely this idea of something symbolic of itself. Because we see that the thing that these scholars call signs or symbols is not a sign because it stands for something, but because it is a sign of itself, because it has a particular science. So there is what I suggest to call a showing property in our relation with thing, which is about the fact that we discover the thing not only has been heavy or heavier than something, but in this being heavy or heavier or too heavy, we can increase this relevance, so and recognize that the thing shows a certain heavy that we can use to compare the thing with other things and so on. So, of course, from the first experience of feeling the heaviness of the thing to having something like the unity of weight and object that can serve as a measure for different things, it's a very long and complex trajectory. And I would like just to stress one point, and I want to propose this way to summarize this idea of things symbolic of themselves, saying that symbols emerge in our engagement with things. And because things showing themselves in what they are for us can also, or they can become things that operate like signs, things that show what they are for us. So there is this super-relation or intertwining between enacting something as a thing and enacting it as a sign, emphasizing, stressing, or amplifying its potential of science, the potential that the thing has to become a sign of what it is already. And what interests me in particular here are the relations of continuity, discontinuity, where you have examples of things, signs, and artifacts where you have a strong continuity between what a thing is and what it shows, like in this example. And then we will see that there are examples where we find more discontinuity between the thing, the experience of the thing as something for something, and the experience of the thing as something that shows something. This is another example very important in material engagement theory. Pottery making has been studied by Malaforis in very, very beautiful descriptions where he emphasizes the kind of dialogue between mind, body, and matter that you have in this practice, the intertwining of skills, material possibilities, where material possibilities are really something that belongs to that kind of particular material, which makes this material different from other materials and which makes the experience that we have with this material something unique, so to speak. And therefore, the specificity of this material makes it possible a unique and original way of thinking with and through this something. And what I would like to stress here is more the fact that the plasticity of the clay affords not only invitations for action, for acting on the thing as something useful for containing something. So it's not just about tool behavior, but it's also about the fact that this material provide us invitations to explore shapes and forms beyond usefulness. So invitations to enact the thing not only in what it does in a strict sense as a tool, but also in what it shows. because this material for the great spectrum of salience, where variations in shape and forms, you cannot make sense of them in terms of usefulness. And this salience, this expressive salience of things is something that I think here we can say that is what makes the making of the tool something more meaningful than the tool making. And then we conclude with another kind of example similar to this one, with basket making. Okay, so and entering the central part of the presentation, which is the more, let's say, systematic one. Here I would like to see what are the challenges of the tools enact meanings, and that, to say it in Heideggerian terms, meaningfulness is more than what is at hand in a strict sense, and what Heidegger calls handiness is not just about what you can reach with hand, is not just about what is useful in a strict sense. And my suggestion here is to bring what we learn from archaeology into being in time, so to speak, and see how one of the reasons, if not the most primordial reason why meaningfulness is more than handiness, is because of the fact that we can use our hands to introduce variations, expressive patterns in the things that we use. And that's the idea that I would like to explore here. And as you can see, I'm trying to explore this intertwining between our experience of things according to a logic of usefulness, where we have the emergence of meanings in what things are for us in a very basic sense, and then a logic of expressivity and salience, where the meaningfulness of things can be reshaped, changed, amplified, reoriented because of our capacity of introducing science in the experience of the thing. And while I think that archaeology is interesting because it helps us understanding precisely the fact that there is this super dimension of things, I think that we kind of need Merleau-Ponty concept, this concept of expression precisely to to integrate Heidegger's account of things according to relations of usefulness. So that's what I'm trying to explore here. So let's see how this idea would frame in Heidegger's Being and Time. So Heidegger, in a very, very nice page, part of Being and Time, says that strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a tool, as a useful thing. Because everything we encounter is part of a totality of useful things. And only we cannot tell what something is without considering what this something is as a part of a totality of relations of usefulness, just like the hammer and the nail. And what I want to stress here, somehow by contrast to Heidegger or against Heidegger maybe, is that there is a sense in which the presence of the thing does not exhaust itself in its being a piece of the same kind of equipment, like the hammer and the nail. And if you think many of the things that we use, collect, and for example, the things of my childhood that I keep stored in a box, they are not related, of course, through relations of usefulness. And they are more like a constellation, I would say, of artifacts. And they are related more like science or expression. So I'm interested in how we live and our experience of things, our being in the world, is somehow a kind of equilibrium between totalities of usefulness of tools and constellation of artifacts, where the things that we use are related more like signs of a symbolic system. Heidegger, a few years later, Being and Time, says he kind of feels that he should make this point clear. He says that despite his emphasis on tools in Being and Time, it never occurred to him that the essence of man consists in knowing how to handle knives and forks or to use a trap. But you see, I wanted to record this example because here we see precisely how handling knives and forks can be a very difficult thing, more like knowing a language and knowing how signs are interconnected, because there are some aspects about these things that you cannot make sense of in terms of affordances. So you have forks that I'm sure that there are aspects in the shapes of these objects that you can derive to the fact that they are better to eat this thing or this other thing, but there are many other aspects that are just about something else, right? And so here we have other examples of how to say it with the terminology that is close to material engagement theory, the things that we use form the scaffold for the emergence of symbols. And you have examples of the fact that a door is not just for entering, baskets are not always just for containing things. And we have also an example that I like because it's the chair of the Pope. So, you know, things, we encounter things through affordances, things invite us to act upon them. We see a chair, we are invited to sit on it, but that works only if you consider what we might call a chair überhaupt, a chair in general. And I hardly think that there is such a thing as a chair in general. Not even the things that you can buy at the IKEA store are just, you know, in general. So what I'm trying to stress here is how the experience of things like a chair can be the scaffold for the emergence of a symbol. A chair which is not about you, which is not affording you to sit on it, is more like, on the contrary, this chair presents you a morphological variation, signs, decorations, that they kind of tell you that is not where you can sit actually. So they are invitations to act differently upon the thing, or to not act upon the thing. And this is where, you know, the what for of the thing is blocked, is changed, transformed, reshaped by the character of showing things. So, so how much time do I have still?
We are still on time. You just need like maybe 5 to 6 minutes.
Okay,
would be okay.
Yeah, thank you. So here I was trying to present this distinction, you know, between two. It's not just about two different accounts of human experience. It's more about the idea that if we want to account for what human experience is about, for the role that things play in our experience as scaffold for symbols, meanings, we have to learn to think human experience as always exposed and determined by a constant becoming or oscillation between the fact that humans are tool makers, but they are also science makers. And what is difficult here is to understand the relations of continuities and discontinuities between how meanings emerge in our acting upon things according to the relevance that something has in a particular context of experience, and our being able to do something, to do things like signs, expressive patterns that act upon minds according to a logical salience. So there are situations in which the salience of things is closely related to the relevance of things. Just think about how we have instructions about how to use things, for example. We have other situations in which, like the example of the throne, the chair of the Pope, where science can really change the whole experience of the thing. I was planning to talk about Merleau-Ponty and how I think in his phenomenology we can find a way to account for both aspects, for how our body allows us to explore the world perceptually, finding meanings, and how we can think tool making in this way, and also how Merleau-Ponty provides us a way to think the discontinuity introduced by expressive acts. But I think I'm going to skip this part because otherwise I don't have time to make the example that I wanted to conclude with. Before going to the example, I think that this oscillation I'm talking about between Homo faber as a tool maker, Homo faber as a sign maker, is at the center also of Malafuri's account of mark making. And in a way, he seems to suggest that mark making is already there. By the way, I won't go into detail here, but I think it's very interesting to consider really that, you know, how archaeologists try to make sense of the very problem of the origin of marks. So how we started making signs, because it's a very challenging question in terms of ecology of perception, for example. So how can you explain the making of such ephemeral and useless feature in the world like a line? And this is, I think, a problem which is also the center of Manfred's account of mark making. And as I was saying, in a way, he seems to suggest the mark making is already there in the crafting of the first tool. He says that the scars of flecking on the surface of the stone offer the first archaeologically visible trace of human mark making. And he says that in later periods, these kind of residual features of the crafting of tools would become memory, symbol, numbers. So he's emphasizing the strong continuity between the making of tools, the residual aspects in the making of tools that are engaged and that would eventually become memory, symbol, number. But he also says that if the markings and engravings of the Middle Stone Age represent anything, is the crafting and exploration of human perception within the changing limits and affordances of the Eucharist ecology. So now he's stressing the discontinuity between the two aspects. And again, I think that Merleau-Ponty might help us understand this relation between continuity and discontinuity. But another way to address this aspect is if we look into recent accounts of aesthetic experience. And I will explain why I think this is relevant for the problem I'm talking about. Sanchez says that a major challenge consists in trying to trace out the continuities and discontinuities between general experience and aesthetic experience. And in her very famous contribution, Brittner says that a crucial question is whether aesthetic experiences are considered differently procedural than regular procedural experiences. The answer is yes, because what changes in aesthetic experience is the very process of perceptual engagement. So we have a different way of perceiving things, a different kind of engagement with the thing. And this difference consists in the fact that there are aesthetic features, aesthetic affordances, that are invitations to act differently upon the thing, and they are invitations that there are features that invite us to take a kind of aesthetic rather than practical stance. So there are features in the experience of the thing that afford a disengagement of goal-directed action. And these are invitations to stop, to interrupt our ongoing environmental interactions with the thing, to have a different kind of engagement with it. And Gallagher goes in a similar direction, separating art behavior and tool use, and speaking about a short circuiting of affordances and actual affordances. And he says very nicely that in perceiving a work of art, there are synesthetic anticipation that I know I can never fulfill or satisfy in the way I would be able to do if I were to perceive the thing as a simple perceptual object, as a tool, for example. So we have a short-circuiting interruption of goal-directed action, which is at the center of what is called aesthetic experience. But what I want to suggest is that the aesthetic object is just one possible way in which we act upon things beyond the usefulness of things, and in a way that is not restricted to basic affordances, so to say. Just think of ritual objects, symbols, images, for example, the way we engage with the surface when we make an image of something, right? And what I want to suggest is the perceptual science of artifacts. What makes artifacts so enriching and an occasion for generating meanings beyond what is relevant and expectable, so to say, within the narrow limits of our ecology, is precisely the presence of invitations not to act upon the thing, which is at the same time the invitation to act differently. And this is because we are able to introduce in the experience of the thing what they suggest to call salient features, aspects, configurations, patterns, forms, or shapes, which we know we can fulfill as we would be able if that was just a tool. And these are the invitations to engage the thing or the part of the thing as a sign rather than a tool. And this, I will conclude on this example of how a tool can be more than a tool. And this is an example of the Equana wicker basket making basket with the wicker, intertwining this material. This is an example of how tool making characteristic of the whole fabric is an expressive act. Not just because some subject, they want to express something. It's just about the expressivity which is intrinsic of the act of basket making. And this expressivity shapes a unique original mythology, which we cannot compare with others. So it would be wrong, if you were to go in this place and look for images in these patterns. That's not how you can make sense of that, because they are not images. They are another way of imagining, another way of telling stories, another way of preserving collective memory, another way of encoding and creating mythologies. And here we have the intertwining I was talking about before, between what we can now define as the material texture of the tool, which is about the relevance that the collective act of basket making has in a particular part of the world, the constructive patterns that are specific of what you can literally, what you can do with that material, the affordances of the wicker. But this is also about how this texture is engaged has a way to express, so that the possibilities of tool making afforded by the material becomes possibilities and limits of salience, ways in which techniques and materials can afford salience. And we conclude just stressing a few aspects. We see again how tool making prescribes, thanks to particular materials and techniques that are used, prescribes an original form of expressivity and a unique way of imagining. And it's interesting how in this unique way of imagining, multiplicity and complexity is obtained through geometrical variations, additions, variations, repetitions, and interplays between background and foreground. And here we should appreciate the role that colors play, because they can transform in a way the technological pattern of the thing into an expressive pattern. And the colors, if you think they are...
Fabio.
Sorry. Yeah.
I am a bit afraid that if we don't close now, we won't have enough time for discussion.
Thank you. I will conclude with this. I think I've said the most important things I wanted to say. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but we really would like to, open the discussion with the audience. So we really want to thank you for your presentation.
From yesterday, I hope that they will.
And please raise your hand if you have any questions, so we have some time for the discussion, maybe. So I see a hand, Christian, and then Rodrigo. Could you be very precise with your questions, please? Christian? Or, well, Rodrigo. I think Christian is not. Yeah, thank you. Can't hear you.
I can't hear you.
Now I can hear you. No, we can't hear you, Rodrigo. Maybe let's try with Francisco. I think this is a bit strange. So, yeah. Okay, Francisco Parra.
Sorry, it's like something that's problematic with turning on the sound. No, do you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will ask something very. Thank you very much, Fabio. It's a pleasure to hear you again. Well, I was wondering about what do you think about what you were working about these tools, right? And observe you related them to this kind of interrelatedness between different tools, So I was wondering how the way in which tools can also be affected, or maybe if you can elaborate more on this idea that maybe even tools can be affected by this normative context in which they are included. For example, that things can be, I don't know, can have an optimality in virtue of the way in which they are included within this context. So I would like to know, what do you think about this? Because for example, when you find in archaeology tools, you have to include them precisely in order to make sense of them. You have to include them in like a bigger context, So I would like, this is the direction of my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you. Chris. So I think that the reason why the question is important and interesting, I will try to put it very, very simply, is that the more a tool is intuitive, the more it's easy for you to get what the thing is for. Like, a tool from thousands of years ago, the less productive of meanings the tool is. And there is for sure a kind of optimality in the tools, which is, I would say, it goes down to, if you think of a tool in a very strict sense, it's about a very simple tools, so tools that we use with our hands. It's something that also Leonardo stresses. But, if you think of that kind of tools, it's very, I would say, not simple, but it's not that difficult to infer the working of the tool from our body. You see a hammer, it's not that difficult to get what the hammer is for. If you know what kind of intelligent being is using the hammer, so there is an optimality which is about our perception and our body. And there is a sense in which there are aspects of things or aspects of tools that you cannot tell knowing how our perception works. And that's where I think the experience of a thing and the transmission of artifacts from one generation to another becomes really something complex, which increases the complexity of cultural transmission and introducing more and more complex meaning, because the more your mind has to figure out what something is for and how this being for is not something that you can tell by the shape of the object plus the shape of the body of the user, the more your mind is getting complex. I don't know if that kind of answer but I would frame there optimality in terms of how you can make sense of things in terms of perceptual optimality.
We have a question from Francisco Parra.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Really interesting. I wanted to ask about the enjoyment of things, right? The fact that there's not always for something a utility, but there's something in the instrument that aesthetically, as the last part of your presentation, there is not a meaning, but a jouissance, a enjoyment of the fact, even decoration, can I say it that way, and not in reference to a mythology or a representative necessarily, but as a matter of fact, like the hammer has a color. I'm thinking also about like Levinas in Totality and Infinity says we don't eat just for gain forces, but to enjoy food, right? Something like that. So that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So the first thing interesting about aesthetic pleasure, or aesthetic and pleasure, if you separate, so it's a complex question, but is that if you see the debate on the first tools that we made, the Andax, right? It's plenty of scholars finding difficult and like, how is that the better way to make that tool? But I mean, some scholars suggested that there are elements in the thing like the symmetry from one side face and the other that was introduced because of a kind of biologically inscribed in us tendency for pleasant symmetry. So that's an important question in debates. What I think is interesting is to frame the problem of, what I would do to answer to your question is framing the problem of enjoyment and pleasure about a certain configuration within the intentional experience of something, where you would have perceptual aspects that you can't fulfill within the ongoing, temporality of predeliminations, fulfillment. And that would be interesting to ask how certain forms, and my idea would be that more than a preference for certain aesthetic patterns would be our capacity of making and recognizing patterns that are not useful in a basic sense. And that would be, I would stress more useless, something useless than something aesthetically pleasant, which might be a way into pleasure or enjoying, because you are actually finding a different way of temporalizing the thing. When you are temporalizing it, and when you perceive an aspect, that brings you out from the chain of what for in order to. That would be.
Okay. So we are running a bit out of time. So what I suggest is that since we already have like 2 long talks and so many discussions, I think it would be better if we have a small break of 10 minutes. I know that there are still some questions to Fabio. So what I suggest is that the people that still want to discuss a little bit more, they will have this 10 minutes break also to discuss a bit further with you, Fabio. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm sorry if
it's much asking, but I think it would be best. So we are back in 10 minutes, and thank you so much, Fabio. And well, yeah.
Fabio, you can maybe answer the question in this break time. If you agree.
Yeah. I think there was also a question from Rodrigo.
I can't hear Rodrigo.
Rodrigo, I think there are some problems with your.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Yeah, now I hear you.
But I can't hear you. I'm very sorry for this. Maybe there I will hear you.
Now it's perfect.
Yeah,
we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I will get. So we have 5 minutes break, but I don't know, Fabio, if it's okay for you. I have just a clarification question. Actually, I was puzzled by this mini.
I can't hear you now.
Like, as far as I understand. Oh, you hear me?
No, I didn't. No, I can't hear. I can't hear you very well. Are you
okay?
Okay, now yes. Let's try.
Okay. I'm sorry. I think.
You can write it maybe or
actually, maybe without the camera we can hear you better.
I will try to do so. I think my Wi-Fi right now is not that stable. So I was wondering, it was more like a clarification question, because I was puzzled about this idea of signs that refer to themselves. So if I understood you well, you didn't come back to this concept, and I think it's not the concept of Heidegger when he talks about tools. So I was not sure of what was you trying to do with that concept, and also actually I was actually puzzled about this idea that some tools can work as signs, but actually like signs of themselves. So I think that the idea of tools that are more than tools is great, and I think you explained it that very well, but that the other idea of signs of themselves was not
necessary right there. So I don't know if you could clarify that, please.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, that's maybe I wasn't clear about that. So the how the two ideas work together is precisely because let's make this example regarding Heidegger is actually interesting because I wrote a paper forthcoming on Heidegger concept of sign and fetishism, and part of what I'm doing is because I come from there, from a kind of criticism of how Heidegger tends to think signs like tools and how he doesn't consider that element in tools which I call science, which would be the fact that the things are signs of themselves. So maybe that's not a good way, but I prefer to speak of science. The reason why I was speaking of science, of things, signs themselves, was to make sense or help making sense of how Malafouris uses the idea of an active sign, because I was struggling with that when I started reading the book. And he also speaks of methodological fetishism, where the emphasis is on the fact that you think a sign with a coincidence between what the sign is, between the thing sign and what the thing sign refers to. And so I know it's a long trajectory, but the point is that let's think in terms of science. You have a tool. There is something about the tool which is about the fact that the tool refers to something else. There is something about the tool which is just about how the tool shows itself in a way that you cannot reduce to its relation to other things. I can make you an example, the hammer that was of my father. For me, it's a very important hammer. It's not something you can substitute like Heidegger's hammer. And I use it. So it's not just like I keep it in a kind of museum, you know. I can use it to work, but every time I hold it in my hand, I see it both like a tool for something and as a sign of itself. Just, you know, it has a kind, what I call science and what I was referring to in terms of something sign of itself is more like if you think in terms of temporality and you have all the, you know, the horizon of anticipations and partial fulfillment, which is just about how also Heidegger makes sense of our experience of the world. The fact is that he makes an example of tools, but there is something in our experience of the thing that kind of stops you, right? So you can still be working with things, but there are some aspects that are particularly strong. They capture our attention, and in that sense, some things are particularly inclined to become signs of themselves. So I can see why, and I'm very thankful to your remark, because maybe it's the first time that when I'm talking about this problem, it's the first time that I'm literally really using the terminology that I find in cognitive archaeology. So maybe it requires more explanation. But I don't know if I answered, but it's really about the fact that there is something about the thing which is the relevance that it has as part of a relation with others, and something that makes it possible for a thing to become, you know, like you think of a hammer. Why, if you think of a hammer or a guitar, what comes into your mind? So what kind of, there is no guitar without, right? So maybe for you, the thing, a guitar that is most symbolic of guitars in general is this guitar, but because it's particularly salient in itself, because when the symbol emerges, is not yet emerging because it represents other guitars. It is emerging because you are attached to that unique thing. That would be.
Yeah, I think I get it. I don't know, maybe just to give you some insights, and since you claimed you're thinking about it and it's kind of a work in progress, maybe in a phenomenological or let's say Husserlian context, it sounds kind of weird. It might sound kind of weird because of this this idea of opposing science and intuition, and the idea that it is as if the tool that you are dealing with was absent somehow. You see, so maybe I'm approaching with a different framework or with the wrong framework, but it was the first thing that came to myself, like, why would I need something to be a sign of itself when you were talking? But now I think I get the idea better, and I would say maybe we should consider distinguishing between being a sign and being a symbol of something.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't have any strong opinion about that.
I can take part of the blame, and some part of the blame I will put on the fact that they work with this idea of an active sign, and so maybe I'm still trying to find out whether I should try to understand better what they say, or whether maybe I presented this kind of topic in other contexts. I was more like into phenomenology, and this time I was trying to do another. So I'm not sure, but I see your point. Now, the distinction between symbol and sign, and yeah, I think that's very useful for me. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for the talk. It was really cool hearing you. Thank you.
All right. So now we are having Santiago Suarez, who's going to present on contributions to a phenomenology of transference. Thank you for the title. Interdisciplinary bilateral transfers between phenomenology and psychoanalysis. Santiago Suarez is a psychoanalyst. He studies psychology at the University of Buenos Aires, and he's currently a doctoral research fellow and tutor at the chairs of Phenomenological and Existential Psychology and History of Psychology at the University of Buenos Aires. He's a visiting doctoral researcher at the Husser Archives at the University of Cologne, pursuing a co-supervised doctoral degree by the funded by the German Academic Exchange Service. So Santiago, you can start now.
Thank you, Rafael, for your presentation. I'm very glad to be here with you, sharing this seminar series. I hope that my talk is up to the level of previous ones, since they were so interesting. And okay, so I'll start sharing screen. So can you all see it now? Yes, okay. So this is an interdisciplinary study between phenomenology and psychoanalysis. It is centered on the phenomenon of transference in psychoanalysis, which I aim at studying from a phenomenological point of view, in particular from the perspective of Husserlian and Merleau-Pontian phenomenology. So there are some, just as a brief background of the research, there are some historical reasons for the proximity between phenomenology and psychoanalysis. But now I will briefly mention more the systematic and conceptual inner reasons for such interrelationships. So it's not just a circumstantial relation between phenomenology and psychoanalysis, but also a relation which has to do with the fact that they share some key points or clue points as regards the conception of subjectivity, in particular when it comes to the genetic phenomenology and the reflection on the basic structures of experience, and a subjectivity which is not centered on the reflexive subjectivity or the reflexing eye, the reflexive eye. So this broadening of subjectivity to other levels of experience which are not centered on this reflexive self-consciousness open a breach and a field for possible exchanges and bilateral contributions between both disciplines. That's why I'm mostly interested in Merleau-Ponty's and Husserl's developments on genetic phenomenology, to understand this phenomenon, which, according to the Freudian theoretical apparatus, is a result of the unconscious, or is a manifestation of the unconscious. So we will go in this direction of claiming that phenomenologically the phenomenon of transference is to be regarded as a result of the operation of passive structures. So let us now analyze how we are going to reach this, the backing this, or the argumentation of this thesis, and at the same time, what do we understand under this expression of the phenomenon of transference. So this is briefly or graphically the scheme of the research. My idea is to analyze the transferential phenomenon in psychoanalysis, and thus to reach also not only a contribution from phenomenology to psychoanalysis, but also by elucidating or illuminating the structures of subjectivity which are at stake in the phenomenon of transference. I hope also to gain some insights into the structures of experience. This is my question here, is not only what does the phenomenology contribute to a deeper understanding of the phenomenon of transference, but also what does the phenomenon of transference teach us about the passive structures of subjectivity which are required in order for this phenomenon to take place. So the phenomenon of transference, in order to define it, it's non-privative of psychoanalysis. So in some other contexts, mainly in psychology, we find this concept sometimes in English as transfer, sometimes as transference. In fact, in the Freudian works in English, we sometimes see transfer and transference, but they always translate the same term in German, which is übertragen. And we have, for instance, transference of learning, emotions, and habits. This is, they always suppose a generalization of experience, which is not just produced to the particular case, but is phenomenologically, we can say, at a non-reflexive level, generalized to a plenty of cases. A typical example of this outside psychoanalysis can be, for example, the conjugation of irregular verbs in children. So if we take the verb to go, for example, in English, the spontaneous generalization according to the rule that is generalized and transferred as transference of learning would be, for example, the ed. So this would be taking the ed termination or ending of the word, and to take it for the verb go. This is I goed would be or I knowed instead of I knew, I went. And these are very typical examples when it comes to listen to very fun, to fun expressions in children who spontaneously make these errors. It is not that they must learn the past form of each verb, but instead that they have this performance or this achievement of transference, which conditions or preconditions this type of errors with the conjugation of regular verbs. So in a broad sense, so now just let us limit ourselves to psychoanalysis. What do we understand by transference in psychoanalysis? So there is a broader sense and a more narrow sense of the term. In a broader sense, it includes the widest spectrum of the phenomena of the treatment phenomena, mainly focusing on the relationship between the patient and the analyst, and all the effects which are triggered, let us say, by the treatment, and how certain manifestations of within the treatment have to do with the design of the psychoanalytic device, for instance, or with the handling of the relationship between patient and analyst. Okay, in a more narrow sense, there are some sources and examples of this concept in Freud. as it is the story case of Dora, for instance, or the so-called Man of Rats. As regards Dora, for instance, this is one of the most famous cases for studying transference in the Freudian works. Dora is a hysterical patient who is taken to treatment by her father. She has a series of bodily symptoms, and she's taken to Dr. Freud, and she starts talking about the symptoms, and then she goes on talking about the familiar background and the relationship background in which these symptoms take place. So what happens here is that the situation which finally ended, but which finally triggered her father's decision to take Dora to treatment with Freud, is that she had a fight with a friend of the family. Mr. K is the name that Freud assigns to this man, and he slaps, and she slaps Dr. K in a very particular scene in a lake. He tries to seduce her, and then he tells her a certain clue phrase, which is my wife doesn't mean anything to me, in order to seduce her. And after listening to this phrase, Dora slaps Mr. K, and she starts a constant fight against Dr. K, Mr. K, and against the familiar situation which her father was also sustaining, because he was a friend of the K, of the K family, and he didn't want to break up. Okay, what is here interesting is that is why this phrase worked like that. This phrase worked like that because some time ago, the housemaid at the house of Mr. K also was tried to be seduced by Mr. K, and when Mr. K tried to seduce her, he also said the same phrase. Dora had already talked to the housemaid, and she already knew that that Mr. K tried to seduce her using this phrase. So when after Mr. K tries to seduce her with the same phrase, she slaps him, and then starts the fight, which leads her to start treatment by her father's decision. So within the treatment, what is interesting is that Dora, after the third session, tells Freud that she would not be coming back again, and that she would be interrupting the treatment. And she does this with 15 days in advance. So this is the same period that the governess and the housemaiden gave at that time to the employer, in this case Mr. K, to tell him that she will not be going on with the work, that she would be quitting. Okay, so Dora is replicating or transferring again the same attitude that she took towards Mr. K to Freud. Freud doesn't understand exactly why this transference takes place, and he explicitly says there is a certain X through which I remember her, Mr. K, and without her knowing that she's repeating, she's nevertheless breaking up the treatment as she broke up the relationship with Mr. K. Finally, the situation ends up with the ending with the sudden ending of the treatment. In the case of the Man of the Rats, for example, and in another writing, which is very famous, which is repeating, remembering, and working through by Freud. He says the patient within transference, or as a result of the transferential phenomenon, instead of remembering the repressed, he starts repeating it, acting it out. So as it is in the case of Dora, instead of remembering the elements of the repressed, which concerned the situation with the case, she instead transferred it to the treatment and suddenly ended the treatment with Freud. In the case of the man of the rats, for example, this patient, according to what could be reconstructed within the treatment, had a latent rage against his father. And what is curious is that according to what he could explicitly remember, he had no notice of having this anger against his father. Nevertheless, he starts having a series of manifestations of anger directed at Freud. So instead of being remembered, they are first introduced and repeated within the psychoanalytic relationship and directed at the analyst without any consciousness of this act of repetition. So Freud says, okay, instead of being angry towards his father, or having rememberings of his being anger with his father, he starts being angry at me, and he starts being distrustful, for example, instead of feeling or of remembering the feelings of failure that were a result of his complex relationship or his conflicted relationship with his father. He starts feeling that he's failing at the treatment itself, although the treatment is working pretty well. Okay, so these are some basic examples of this phenomenon. What is interesting is that here we have a repression of fantasies and drives, but within the relation to the analyst. But also, it's not non-linear. It's not that we always, in the transferential phenomenon, find a linear transference or a transposition, which is literal or linear, but also which is sublimated by symbolic equivalence. For example, it doesn't need to take the same content. This is what I mean. It's part of the transferential phenomenon, for example, that a patient can, for instance, say that people are not trustworthy because they are mischievous, for example, and they are not to be trusted as regards money, for example. And in the same session, or after this same session, okay, this is just a void, so to speak, a void claim. So without the context, we don't know. Maybe this patient was deceived by some people, and it may be the case, most likely. But after the session, suddenly he pays more than he should, for example, for the session. So again, so it is not linear, it's not literal, it also may be sublimated, and the clue fact is that here the relationship to the analyst starts taking or is endowed with the sense that comes from other fantasies, drives, and from the repressed contents. So what was repressed here is his own being, his own part at being deceived by the other, for example. And how after bringing this to the treatment, for example, with this patient, what was very interesting is that he's being deceived, he's ceding too much regarding the other, for example, paying more than he should, was a way of not confronting with the other one. So it was a way to, so to speak, to grant the last place is the best option in order not to confront with the other, and in order not to feel the tension of hostile drives. I don't know if this is clear. So if we are in a competition, it is very clear that there will be no tension between me and my and the rivals, for example, and the competence, if I am granting myself to gain the last place in the competition. So, and this was what he was doing, but this could only be spoken out after this transferential phenomenon in which he was ceding too much. Without this transferential phenomenon, it would be perfectly rational, so to speak, that he had bad luck, and that the others were not trustworthy, and that the others are deceitful people, for example. So, but the transference here enabled the treatment to unlock certain layers of the unconscious and repressed, which regarded his own relationship to the hostile drives and to the competition with the other, and to the relationship of rivalry. Okay, so there are some dimensions of transference in order to isolate some variables of the phenomenon. So at least 3, we can say. First, transference of feelings, as it was this transference of, for example, of anger, the transference of being deceived by the other person, the transfer of affects, for example, again, and drives and fantasies. In this case, it's not the transference of the drive, but of the inhibition of the drive. In this case, ceding too much or conceding too much, and being deceived by the other who is taking an advantage of this attitude of the subject. This is a content or affective dimension of the phenomenon. Then we have the act repetition of the past, which substitutes the memory of the past. So in this case, we have the act or the behavioral dimension of the phenomenon. And thirdly, we have the actualization of the past in the present, the temporal dimension, because the transference is not only transference of feelings, transference from memory to act or to behavior, but also transference from the past to the present, and at the same time losing the past sign. So it's lived as a present event or present episode. Okay, so up to here we have some important aspects of the phenomenon. What is repeated? So let us now characterize it theoretically according to Freud's apparatus. What is repeated here? We said unconscious fantasies, character traits, dispositions, inhibitions, as it was the case of this third patient I mentioned, and the pathogenic drives. Of course, symptoms are also actualized and repeated within treatment. And this has to do with the fact that symptoms are figurations, according to Freud, are figurations of unconscious fantasies and substitute satisfactions of repressed drives. So when we say that fantasies and drives are actualized or repeated within the treatment, we are also indirectly saying that symptoms are also repeated in the relationship to the analyst. The analyst is inserted, and at this phenomenon of transference, the analyst is inserted in psychic series, which are established in the patient before the treatment. These psychic series are unconscious, as it is the series between, for example, in the case of Dora, Mr. K and Freud, or, for example, in the case of the Man of the Rats, as it was the father and Freud, and as it was in the third patient I made mention of, between, for example, the rival and the analyst. Okay, this psychic series function according to certain imago. This is the technical term which Freud coins for these models. and follows or is restricted to certain models or cliches. This is the behavior, for example, and drive and fantasies follow these patterns or cliches which have this repetitive characteristic. This point is very important. So transference is not an accidental phenomenon; it's a regular phenomenon, and it's and for Freud himself, it is regarded as a means for approaching the unconscious, thanks to the way it is actualized or repeated via repetition. Yeah, okay. Thanks to the way the repressed is enacted or acted out and repeated. It's a means of access to the repressed, as it was very clear in the case of this patient who was paying more than he should. Then we have what Freud regards as a dynamic turn. Transference is very important for psychoanalysis. It's technically very important because it expresses at the same time the repressed in act, we can say, and at the same time the resistance against the contents of the repressed. This is, if there were no resistance against the repressed, it would be remembered instead of being repeated. And that's why transference symbolizes at the same time, or embodies at the same time, this conflictive motions, or these motions in conflict. The motion which wants to be remembered, brought back, and the motion which is impeding a complete or a thorough coming back in the form of a memory, and therefore it comes back in an unconscious way and just as a repetition. That's why for Freud, what is important in dynamic terms, it's not the fact that the analyst can interpret the transference. We can be very, very good at interpreting symptoms, for instance, but the labor of the analysis, the main task of the analysis, thanks to this reflection of transference, is focused not on the analyst's interpretation of the hidden contents of the repressed contents, but on the patient's developing capability, or increasingly capability, to remember instead of repeating. So what is very interesting is that Freud says, okay, we can get information from the family, for example, of a patient, of what happened, and we just can communicate it. We can either be very good interpreters, or we can have very good sources of information, and we can communicate the repressed to the patient. But what will be the result of that? Will be the repression overcome by that? No. The repressed will go on being repressed, because the labor of the analysis, the main task of the analysis, is to produce association and to produce the fulfillment of the associative rule, and not just communicating the content of the repressed. So there is a shift here from a focus on the content of the repressed, from a focus on the achievement to be able to remember what was repressed. This is what Freud called the transference neurosis. The transference neurosis is the fact is the name of the fact that the symptom is acted out in the transference, is repeated in transference, and at the same time that precisely by means of this repetition, it is the best way to approach what is repressed, in order to make this shift from repetition to remembering. So transference is at the same time a threat against the treatment, as it is the case of Dora, for example, but at the same time is the best tool of the analysis in order to treat the symptoms, because the symptoms have this transferential structure. So as a result of this, the treatment of the transference and the maneuver of the transference, the handling of the transference, and overcoming and the overcoming of transferential resistances leads at the same time to this overcoming of a symptom. There is then this correlation between the structure of the two. That's why transference has this crucial technical role in the psychoanalytic cure. So the main questions here at this point are what, so Freud describes very well this phenomenon, and so how it factically or empirically takes place, and how the analyst may handle it, for example. So, but not the inner structures. This is my point where I make reference to the phenomenology. So he doesn't make any reference to the structures by means of which transference is a regular phenomenon and is regularly constituted. My question here, so what I do here at this point is a turn which is very typical of the phenomenological method, which is turning from the phenomenon to the subjective conditions of the phenomenon. So in this case, we ask, as regards the genesis of transference, what subjective performances and structures of experience make it possible for the constitution of transference? And what structural characteristics does the bond with the analyst have that enable this transferential actualization of the symptom? Then we have a second axis of research questions, which regards not the genesis of transference, but the dynamics of transference within treatment. This is the treatment and the resolution of transference in the treatment. Here the questions are, what are the structural characteristics of the transference that make it possible for the treatment to influence the structure of the symptom? This we said that there is this jump from the symptom to the transference and from the transference to the symptom, that the symptom is not directly attacked by the treatment, but that the symptom is overcome in correlation to the overcoming of the transferential resistances. But what is overcome itself is the transferential resistances, not the symptom itself. But the question here at this point is, what are the structural characteristics that make that this jump is not contingent, that it's something regular and structural, which is the inner relationship between transference and symptom then? And also related to this question, why are the effects of psychoanalysis accompanied by this resolution of transference and the overcoming and elimination of transferential resistances? The question here is why the permanent alteration of the patient's economy entailed necessarily the dismantling of the transference as a guarantee of the non-suggestive character of psychoanalysis. This is in the same way that Freud says that, okay, what we intervene on transference and the effects of psychoanalysis are on transference and then secondarily transposed to the symptom. We need to explain this, to account for this, but at the same time, it's curious that Freud says that necessarily we need, in order to guarantee that the effects of psychoanalysis are non-suggestive, that what is transformed, it's not the symptom itself, but the transferential manifestations. If the transferential manifestations do not suffer any substantial modification, we then are most likely to think, and it would be more prudent to think that the remissions of the symptoms are just circumstantial and due to suggestion. And this is what the suggestive therapies consist of. So this handling of the transference and this inner bond between, or structural bond between transference and symptom, and the way psychoanalysis has effects on the symptom by attacking or handling this transferential phenomena, are at the core of the definition of the psychoanalysis. This is, they define the essence of what constitutes a psychoanalytic treatment in comparison to other possible treatments, as it is, for example, the paradigm for Freud of a suggestive treatment, which is, for example, hypnosis.
Santiago, I would like to ask you to try to conclude soon, because we are a bit out of time.
Okay, so I will try to be fast. In this, so now let us turn to the so up to now psychoanalysis and the questions we arrived at. The phenomenological tools I'm taking for approaching this come from Husserlian phenomenology and from Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. So in the case of Husserl, I'm mainly centered on the apperceptive analogizing transference, which is presented in the fifth Cartesian meditation in the sections between 49 and 54. There is, according to Husserl, an assimilative apperception, which is not no analogical thought. It is not an act of it is no act of thinking, but it belongs to the domain of passivity, and it conditions a transference of sense by means of which a certain object. This is a performance by means of which a certain object is endowed with a sense of another object, which is transferred to it. What is important at this point is that in both in Freud as it is in Husserl, we find a certain type of subjective performance, which at the same time is not determined by a physiological process. For example, it's not naturally determined, but at the same time, it doesn't belong to a psychological conscious determination. So they are subjective without belonging to the reflexive consciousness, and therefore they belong to the domain of passivity or to the unconscious in Freudian terms. But they show us also they focus on a conception of the unconscious, which doesn't have to do with the content which is transferred, but with the performance of transference, not with the noematic side of transference. This is the content of what is transferred, but with the dynamic structures, noematic structures, subjective structures, which are conditioned of these structures for taking place. And this is very important, because if we only center on the content, it's very hard to explain the regularity of transference. The fact that transference, it's not an isolated and contingent phenomenon, but that, okay, the content is circumstantial, but the fact that transference takes place, it's not circumstantial. And that's why describing transference as a structure of the passive synthesis and as a form of the passive synthesis is important to account, in order to account for this regular character of the phenomenon. Okay, the long section of the Husserlian text I will skip, and then okay, here we find this sense anticipating or pre-giving role of transference as a regular structure of experience. The past, at the same time, it shows us this Husserlian legality, or this legality of the passive synthesis described by Husserl, shows us that the past prelays or outlines a sketch of experience, which is passively transferred to the new case and passively generalized, and operates passively without enriching the present, but not as an objective past, but as an operating past. It's not a past which I remember, but past which is operating and which is just shown, not in terms of content which is remembered, but in terms of the enrichment of the sense of what is given. Then I make reference to Brushinska. It will take some time to make this presentation, how Brushinska enters and Brushinska's developments are intersected with this, but it's an important reference. Her main thesis is on the bivalence of experience and how experience has a double source, which is impressional, apperceptive, and imaginary phantasmatic. And she deems the constitutive imaginary phantasmatic consciousness as experiential structure of the unconscious. And basically, this form of consciousness, or this structure of consciousness, which in Freudian terms can be regarded as unconscious fantasy, is characterized by the transitive and medial or transformative and reinterpretative structure that co-functions alongside impressionally founded perception. This is, the materials of perception, or the contents of perception, are not purely perceptive, but are at the same time bivalent and medialized by the phantasmatic contents and by this phantasmatic structure, which mainly regards drives. So Brushinska's attempt is a way to lay a bridge between Freud and Husserl, which is very interesting in order for analyzing how this, how the drives and the symptoms can be transferred to the bond to the analyst, for example, and how the relation to the analyst can be medialized, namely by phantasmatic contents which co-function alongside the impression. This is Freud rationally doesn't inspire any similarity to K. It's not Freud's nose, for example. Yes, it's not a vertical nor empirical, sensorial or mechanistically founded similarity which inspires this transference, but the medialization of the sense due to the co-functioning of the phantasmatic structures. Okay, then in the case of Merleau-Ponty, we find a critique of, he makes an explicit reference to transference, but when he speaks of transference, he doesn't speak of the Husserlian transference, but of the term for the empirical psychology, mainly for the behavioral psychology. So he's quite critic of the term because it has this resonance, and he criticizes the term according to the way this term is understood within this framework. But at the same time, he talks of the body, or he presents the body as a synergic system of transpositions and equivalences, and as a general symbolic of the world. He speaks of these transpositions of significations which take place between different domains of experience, between different sensorial domains, and between different domains of experience in general, beyond perception itself, or beyond sense perception itself. A case of this, for example, is Schneider. And Merleau-Ponty is interested, for instance, in some disturbances in Schneider, which are which are disturbances, namely of the sexual and the affective scheme. He says, okay, the perception is not originally fragmented in different domains, which secondarily need to be synthesized. This transposition and this unity is primary and doesn't need to be established secondarily, nor by a deductive consciousness, which by inference or comparison or by analogy, for example, so it's very similar in this case to Husserl, establishes the bridge between the dominions. For example, in the case of Schneider, it says Schneider feels no desire to go for a walk, for example. He can only experience that he wants to go somewhere if he has an explicit aim or goal, which is directing him at this place, for example. Or he says the bodies have lost for him the expressive character. A woman is attractive for Schneider just due to the personality, just due to abstract and idealized characters, but not as a result of the style itself or of the person. So it's just it just takes place on a reflective level. And what is and this case is interesting for Merleau-Ponty. So he says the landscape doesn't inspire him anymore. The faces are not sad, are not warm anymore. So, and this is important because what is shown here is that Schneider can make the comparison and the analogy, but at the same time, this is revealed as pathological. And by contrast, what this shows is that this jump or leap between different or primary unity between the different domains of experience, including the sexual and the affective scheme, is primary, and when and what we deem as pathological is are the cases when this primary unity doesn't take place. So furthermore, Merleau-Ponty analyzes, for example, in the course of the Sorbonne of the year 1951, the relationships of the child to the adult, to the other, the behavioral contagion, on which I will not focus on because we are running short of time.
Yeah, actually, we need to close because we already used the time for discussion.
Okay, so I will. Okay, so very briefly, as regards a phenomenology of transference and as conclusions, what which we can draw for our former questions. So as regards the Husserlian phenomenology, we can find, or with the Husserlian instruments, we can describe the passive constitution of psychic series and the insertion of the analyst within this series, and therefore the transference of objective sense from one object to the other. Then with Merleau-Ponty phenomenology, we are also able to explain not only the transference between objects, but between different domains of experience and between different experiential fields. It is very important for psychoanalysis to be able to describe how a symptom, which is psychic, is converted to the body, and how a symptom, which is a bodily symptom, as it is the case of Dora's symptom, may also find a translation or a transferential correlation, which makes it, which enables it to be repeated within the psychoanalytic device. So this jumps between the psychic to the body and the constitution of the symptom, then from the symptom to the transference and to the bond and the relationship to the analyst, and finally, as regards to treatment, from the transference to the symptom and to the life in general, and it accounts for the effects of the psychoanalysis itself. This is, without this structure, this transferential structures, and without this primary unity and articulatedness of the object and of the experiential fields, we wouldn't be able to account for the effect of the psychoanalysis on the symptoms, unless, for example, we just try to control the symptom. But what is interesting is that the effects of psychoanalysis don't have to do with our capability of inferring consequences or our deductive and reflective capabilities. So it is not that if we are more intelligent or more sophisticated in terms of our representational analysis and our intellectual analysis, the symptoms will disappear. So the overcoming of symptoms depends not on our deductive capabilities and our reflective processes, but is dependent on this primary unity between what we experience in the experience of a psychoanalytic relationship and how this experience finds echoes on the body, on the symptom, and are generalized to our life. In fact, if it wasn't as a result of these structures, we would say that the experience of psychological, not only in psychoanalysis, treatment, that the effects would just be limited to overcoming a symptom. But far more from that, what is most interesting from psychoanalysis and from a psychological treatment, it's not just the fact that we solve a certain symptom, that we get rid of a symptom. It's not just an alternate version of the medical treatment by which we want to get rid of a symptom. Furthermore, it is the other way around. The symptom is an excuse in order to start subjective process which goes far beyond the symptom itself, because the symptom is a symbol, or works as a symbol which embodies the whole human subjectivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santiago. So I am afraid we are running out of time, so we won't have time for discussion. What I would like to ask you is whether you can write your email address in the chat, so people who want to discuss questions with you have still the chance also to give feedback for your presentation. So I would like to thank you, Santiago, Fabio, and Rosemary, for your interesting talks, and also the audience for an interesting discussion from today. So since this is the last session of Phenomenological Transfers, Representations, Images, and Social Imaginarios virtual conference series, I would like to say a few words also in behalf of the organizers, Luz Azcárate and Rodrigo Sandoval, and also for myself. We want to thank all the speakers and all the participants during the last few months. So we started this conference in March, and it has been running already for a while. So we want to thank our loyal supporters coming each 15 days and sacrificing their Saturdays, especially to Mariana Chu, Vania Alarcón, and the team of the Peruvian Circle of Phenomenology and Hermeneutics, Rosemary, of course, and the Dirección of Tecnologías de la Información at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru for taking care of the virtual platform supporting the conference during this time. So I think that the conference has been a good space for reflection and discussion on the epistemic potential of phenomenology, and especially in relation to knowledge collaboration with other disciplines. So the idea of transfers, as we have been trying to elaborate in the conference, basically refers to the transdisciplinary knowledge exchange, which are becoming more and more ubiquitous in academia. So I think that the actuality of phenomenology, to a certain extent, has to do not only to the study of the phenomenological tradition, but also in the use of this tradition to as a means to think the things themselves, as well as to think about the responsibilities and the necessities for phenomenologists to engage and participate in debates with academics from other disciplines. So I don't know if Rodrigo or Luz want to say some final words, but that's all on me. Thank you again.
Thank you. And have a very nice day and a nice evening.
And hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
¿Se queda algún